Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. So today I have a few issues here. We're gonna get started with the first one, I guess. So just for some background, almost 10 years ago now, we added this thing called TypeInfo to the runtime. That was our attempt of splitting reflection from basically the core layer, like System.Object. And we added a bunch of extension methods to basically go from one to the other over the years. And ever since .NET Core 2 and .NET Standard 2, when we kind of undid a lot of these things and brought back all the old APIs, these new things are kind of just sitting there and they don't really do anything anymore. I mean, they still work, you can still call them, it's just confusing. So part of this proposal here is to effectively hide all of those older extension methods. And yeah, that's basically it. They're still there, you can still call them. It would just hide the type and the extension methods so stuff doesn't show up. And then I think there's some corresponding things over here where we added them to specific types. And yeah, same rationale there. Are there any objections to this? Any concerns with that?
My only question is, do we want to also put an obsolete on something and suggest people rewrite their code, or do we just say hide it and be done?
Doesn't really hurt anything, right? It's just we don't want, this isn't the recommended path, but it functionally it's fine. It's not adding a lot of overhead or anything like that.
I believe that's true. I mean, they literally just, if you go into any of these implementations, I think all they do is they just do the, the old style API pattern, right? So they all call through the same APIs you would still recommend. The reason the only reason I wouldn't obsolete them is it kind of feels like you're slapping people twice. So I've already slapped them once for, oh, by the way, the thing you did for 10 years, no longer good. You have to do this other thing. Then the people went through this exercise, converted their old code to what was back in the day, the new pattern. And then we undid all of it and said, oh, just kidding. The old pattern will continue to work. And so telling those people that all of those things are obsolete just feels wrong, because I don't think we would ever remove those APIs. So I would not bother obsoleting them.
I mean, we've never removed anything, but it's really assuming that these types are no longer getting new additions. If we've added anything on any of the other reflection types, then these are getting out of date. So it's just is it worth telling somebody, thanks, but you're on a dead end?
I mean, these are all extension methods, right? So like they are basically not discovered by calling into those types, right? They're discovered via the other place where we would expose the new APIs, right? So they're already dotting into the correct type. So if there's new investments that are being done, then they're going to see them, right?
Okay.
It just seems
as extensions. Sorry, go ahead. Finish that topic and then ask the question.
Yeah, it just feels backward to just tell them, don't call this API, call this other API with virtually the same signature, right? And in some cases, in fact, they have the same signature, so they already bind to the other one. Because we designed them kind of to match the existing signature, so I think for the most part, people don't call them anyway. So, yeah.
I don't actually know how the editors work here. If you tag the extension class as editor browsable never, does that implicitly impact anything defined on the type? No. You actually have to go and put never on every individual extension method.
Correct.
Really?
Yeah. So basically what happens is when you hide the type, if you dot into the whatever namespace the type is in, you don't see the type. And then once you're
dot off of one of the extended things, you still see the extension method?
Yeah, so it's not even specific for extension methods. It's the same behavior for regular types, right? If you put editor browsable on the type, you don't see the type. But once you dot into the type, you will see all its members. And so that's the same here. I mean, it kind of makes sense if you squint, right? Because if you look at regular types, it makes sense to hide a type and then say, well, when you start using the type, well, then, by all means, see its members, right?
It's making me wonder if we want to be more aggressive about using editor browsable never on types that are purely extension types, even where we fully 100% believe in all the methods defined on it. In general, we don't intend for those methods to be used as statics. It makes me wonder if we want to hide them from IntelliSense so that they're not cluttering up the IntelliSense list.
I mean, maybe. I mean, like, a couple of weeks ago, we had the discussion with the C# team about the new direction of extensions, right? They spent a decent amount of time talking about the escape syntax, right? And I mean, it's still the escape syntax in case of conflicts. So it seems like weird to hide the type, because then how would they ever get to be used, right? The problem, I mean, this is kind of why I kind of agree with Jeremy on the general guidance. Give these things useful names, right? Because if you look at some of the stuff that happened in extensions where everything is foo extensions, and then some of the core namespaces are basically just types of extension methods, and it's hard to find the types that actually do anything. That's unfortunate. So I think we just have to get better at naming those types. And not just suffixing everything with extensions, but yeah.
Yeah, it's fine.
All right, then I guess we let me just copy paste the entire thing here.
I don't know if you can. It looked like it was in multiple segments.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. All right. There's one more. I think it was only 2 though, right?
Scroll more.
Yeah, it's only 2. Yeah, it's all system reflection, right? Yeah. Yeah, seems to work. All right, next one.
This one we probably do need Steve for, right?
Probably, yeah. I don't have any context on that one. Yep, let's skip that one then. Kevin, Jeremy.
Kevin.
Yay. Okay. So this is a proposal to obsolete all of the constructors on Rfc2898 derived bytes, which is PBKDF2, just in case nothing was clear. The reason to do this is a couple releases ago, I don't remember specifically which one, we implemented static APIs off of this class called PBKDF2, and they are one-shots. Unlike some of the other shots we've added, the one-shots for PBKDF2 are the intended way to use the algorithm. The way that it was previously designed, when you instantiate this class, you can call a method called getBytes, and that lets you stream back bytes from the KDF. The reason why that's not desirable is in .NET, we defer most of our cryptographic implementations down to the platform. And the platform itself, whether that's OpenSSL or Windows or Mac OS or whatever, they all give you a one-shot because that is the intended way to use the algorithm. That prevents us from implementing the instance-based version on top of the platform. It will always need to be written in managed code on top of HMAC. So this obsolescence is intended to steer people away from using the instance-based version of this because it does things it's not supposed to. And it will never be FIPS compliant, and you should be using the one-shot. We have previously obsoleted some of the constructors for a different reason. So the intention for this one is to remove the obsolete it under a new diagnostic ID so that people that previously suppressed it need to reevaluate it. And this time it will be a stronger, like, you really need to stop using the constructors for this. The only wrinkle for this one is it's not a sealed class. I did do some looking around. Very few people have ever derived from this class. Most of the times when they do, it's just for test reasons, or they're trying to mock something or whatever. And it's not like a real scenario where you would be depriving the ability to do something they couldn't do with the one-shots.
Can you reiterate one more time why it's so bad to be using these? I heard not FIPS compliant. I heard implemented in managed code. What
Those are really the same thing.
Right. What was the other? What were the first ones?
Largely just it gives you a way to use the algorithm in a way that wasn't really designed to. The PBKDF2 is a KDF, and basically you give it your key, you give it a salt, you give it a number of iterations, and it says, great, tell me how big of a key you want, and that's it, operation done. The way that it's...
might you be using RFC2898 as part of some system where, like, you need to agree with the other side in some fashion?
Possibly.
Because obsolete is basically saying, do not use this. But if there are still valid, like, there's a difference between this is never going to be functionally correct versus, well, yeah, we don't want you using it, but if you have a strong reason to use it, like, go, like, we don't obsolete SHA-1, but we don't want people using it unless they absolutely have to.
The .NET streaming implementation, I think aside from the fact that we're literally the only implementation I've ever seen that is streaming, meaning if you call it twice with the same, or you call this constructor, you call getBytes 16, then you call getBytes 16 again. That's the same as if you called getBytes 32 and then split your array in half. Literally no one else has that functionality. And so that's the first part that we're weird. And the second part, I think it's this one, but maybe I'm thinking of just our implementation of PBKDF1. If we keep giving answers beyond the point when the algorithm says you need to have stopped because the answers are no longer defined. So the only thing that this is compatible with is itself. The static functions are compatible with everybody else.
The one where the internal counter overflowed, that did get fixed a couple releases ago, and it will throw now. But Net Framework doesn't do that. If you try to extract like a 85 gigabyte key or something with SHA-1, it will overflow.
So
I'm a bit confused then. So, like, there seems to be, so is PBKDF2 then the same algorithm just with a different API shape, or is it a different algorithm?
RFC2898. So the RFC2898 puts forth two functions, PBKDF1 and PBKDF2.
Okay.
And .NET, or whatever the hell reason, my predecessors decided to call PBKDF1 derived bytes, password derived bytes, and PBKDF2 RFC2898 derived bytes, even though they come from the same spec. We have a static function on RFC2898 derived bytes called PBKDF2, since that's actually the name that anybody's looking for, and they never find this type by name.
Yeah, so then it sounds like what you're saying is it is the same algorithm or the same spec, it's just a different API, right? So that would go back to what we said, that this API shape is just not great. So it's not so much as us deprecating SHA-1 in favor of SHA-2 as much as it is saying the shape under which we expose SHA-1 is bogus, so don't use this API, use this other one. In which case, obsolete does seem more reasonable. The only thing I didn't quite understand is like, Kevin said, like, there's a wrinkle that people derive from this type, but like, why would that be a wrinkle? I mean, you can still derive, you just get an obsolete warning like everything else, right?
I don't think it's a real concern. I was just pointing out that anyone that inherits from this class is not going to be able to have their constructor call one of these constructors without suppressing the obsolation.
Right. Yes. But that, yeah, it kind of, to me, it's just in the same bucket of like, you need to rewrite your call side, right? And so that's true in both cases.
Two 500 megabyte 512 megabyte key out of this thing, which is absolutely not what PPKDF2 was meant to be used for, but the instance space let them do it. And you can't realistically do a 512 megabyte key as a one shot. So the obsolation would force some people to either suppress or reconsider their design for why do I need a key that big?
I mean, I'm not a crypto guy, right? But like, based on what I heard earlier, it sounded like you are not actually at that point spec compliant. You're in the undefined territory category because you exploit the streaming that only we provided, nobody else does, right?
Yeah, I think I'm not trying to walk back my obsolation. I'm trying to explain.
I get it. But like, I'm just saying, to me, that seems reasonable because, you know, these algorithms so it's not like a regular API where you can say, hey, yeah, we kind of didn't intend that use case, that people use it. It's widely used, so we shouldn't, you know, kneecap people using that for those things. But I feel like for things like crypto or other things where the whole point of these algorithms is to, you know, provide a spec, implement a spec, or share data of other platforms that implemented that spec, it does seem reasonable to say, sorry, like the API should allow you to do something that wasn't spec compliant, and we're obsoleting this. I mean, if you really insist, you can still do it, but we really don't want you to do those things. And so in this case, I think it's fine to say, yeah, the one shots don't have that, but that's not a limitation. That's by design kind of thing, right? So I'd be okay with that.
Okay.
Any other concerns? Nobody's saying anything, so that's a good sign, I think.
Finally, one that I thought would be easy was actually easy.
Well, the trick is you didn't say you thought it's easy. As soon as you make the announcement, like, then it becomes hard.
Just curse things.
All right. Keep that in mind as you talk about the next one, Jeremy.
Right. So the motivation for the issue, it's going to go a little bit off on a tangent, but the motivation of the issue is somebody brought in a PR that makes asking for a lot of small random numbers at once more efficient. And they did that as an implementation detail for our random number generator.shuffle. And instead of just taking it there, instead we're exploring, what if we just made this, you know, first class API that anybody could batch things? And then once we have a batch, then we can now decide to do shuffle in terms of that. So the idea is for things like shuffle or choose, we called choose get items, I think. So for get items, it's super easy. You think, you know, you're rolling a bunch of dice. You want 6 random numbers that are 0 to 5. You should be able to call and say, hey, give me 6 random numbers between 0 and 5. And that would be the first overload here. You would say 2 exclusive is 6. You give a span that has a length of 5, and it writes 6 things into it. The reason for doing this is it gets to then do it in fewer calls to the random number generator. So this ends up speeding up your call to the RNG, assuming it's actually binding on your perf line. It makes the random number component between 7 and 15 times faster. as if you ask for enough stuff. So the things that were important from looking at shuffle were the fill int 32, the fill int 32 that you get to specify the lower bound. Actually, no, all of these would be for get items. Fill uint 32, which is actually the worker function, because as with most things with numbers, it's easier to work with the unsigned than the signed. And then this complicated looking fill uint 32 that takes a span of upper bounds and a span of destination, and they have to be the same length. And it's for the case when not all of your upper bounds are the same, which is how shuffle works. And then we explode it for the rest of the stuff at the bottom of the screen is, let's take a from inclusive and to exclusive for all the sizes and all the signedness. So it explodes this into a much bigger thing if we care, but the top 4 are really the meat of the proposal. And then there's a part 2 and how it would impact System.Random lower.
So I don't have a strong opinion on this. I mean, like, the general idea seems sound. A little bit noisy in terms of APIs, but most of them are overloads. So I think that's just the way these things go. Do we have a sense for whether the scenario is something we believe in? Like, do we think that there is a perf dimension to RNGs that we would care to optimize? Or is this just some random person having some random thoughts and we could do it, but we don't actually believe that it would marginally impact anything real?
I honestly can think of no scenario where asking for random numbers for shuffle or rolling dice or calling the get items API where the RNG should be your perf limitation. So to me, this is a thing that's fast enough, and we found a way to make it faster. But if we're not willing to do it in public API, we shouldn't be willing to do it in our implementation of those algorithms either. Either we think it's a real scenario or we don't.
Well, I'm not sure that that's true. From my perspective, one is an implementation detail that just makes it faster. The other one requires surface area that you have to change your code to use. A lot of the performance optimizations we do are under the covers, and they just make your existing stuff faster, and they would require a much higher bar for improvement if it was exposed via surface area. I'm not saying that's reason to do it, but I wouldn't.
I guess there are 2 perspectives. There's System.Random, which if we decide we don't want any of these methods, we can take the batched random improvements. And then there's I have to fill out government paperwork talking about what we do behind the covers for the CSP RNG. For the CSP RNG, we will not take a speed up if we don't take it in public API.
Yep.
That's just a policy decision.
One of the APIs that is currently sitting as an API suggestion is a generic version of next. Next of t, where t is I binary integer or something like that. If we were to add this, it'd be nice if we didn't have to add the bazillion overloads and could just start doing things here that were generic instead.
I don't know that from generic math we'd be able to do this, because I don't know if generic math defines full width multiplication. All of the batching algorithms require, for example, when doing batched uint 32, that you get the full 64-bit multiplication. So you need the 32-bit.
I mean, even if they didn't,
carry.
we could limit the t that's used to ones that we know about.
It shouldn't be a limit though, because we have the relevant constraints. I think it'd be more than just I binary integer, but it would be I binary integer and I'm in max value of t. But we have the ones that allow you to say I have finite constraints And from those, you can determine the maximum number of bits supported. And so you can then generate a 2's complement sequence of bits and use the other APIs on iBinary integer to construct from that 2's complement bit representation. So all the APIs are there, and we'd have a valid fallback for any t that was iBinary integer and min max value. We would just naturally accelerate it for the core primitive types and do something better.
So I think just to be specific, looking at the implementation Jeremy was referring to, you can do something like big mul with generic math. I think that's the crux of the thing needed.
Yeah, you can have. I don't think we have a big mul on binary integer, but we have all of the APIs such that you can roll your own big mul if required.
How?
Because we know how to get the 2's complement representation.
Sure, but this is how with generic math would you take int32 and int32 and get either int64 or the int32 upper mul and int32 lower mul?
The same way that you do it for int128 using 2 ulongs. There's a very specific multiplication algorithm that gets you the half bits and the next half bits. And you can use that provided you know the number of 2's complement bits in the representation.
Fair enough.
It wouldn't be fast if we had to fall back for really random t's, but we have the necessary logic to know that it is a t of finite size and thus work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to just mark it as API needs work and basically say if somebody can come up with a proposal that is just, 1 or 2 methods, I think that's more reasonable. And then we can approve that. And I kind of agree, like it makes sense to me to say, even if you have a generic constraint and we can't do everything with it, you can always special case, right? Either for acceleration purposes or for, just making certain operators work.
Fair enough.
All right, then, no, not that. Here we go.
The yellow one.
Did I comment actually? I did not. It goes. Next one, Regex match.
Yeah, the next few are just analyzers for Regex. I've been helping a variety of folks move code bases to newer versions of .NET and looking at the kinds of things that they hit. And this one has popped up in every single code base. I don't know if it's because people are porting from other languages that don't have the equivalent of IsMatch, but people end up writing literally some regex.match and then immediately followed by .success, which is exactly what IsMatch is, except IsMatch is faster because it doesn't actually need to do all the stuff to, for example, do all the captures and create the match object and so on. It's significantly faster. So this would just be an analyzer that would recognize this expression and a fixer that would translate it to use IsMatch.
So category would be performance and severity would be, what is that, info or whatever we call it?
Yeah, suggestion info, the non-breaking one, as long as people haven't said all analyzers are warnings.
Yeah.
And just clarifying here, Steve, you've actually seen a bunch that are basically doing it as if regex.match.success?
100%.
Okay, so they're not holding the group and then or holding the match and looking at it later. This is just the straight up.
They don't even have
the
access.
object away.
They don't even have access to the match object because they're just dotting off of the results of match directly. In fact, we could make the analyzer more, more involved. Someone's storing it into a local and then they're only using .success off of the local, but I've seen much less of that and much more of just using it as an expression.
Yeah, that seems pretty easy to reason about, and yeah, I like it.
Yep.
Next one is similar. We introduced, so the previous one works on all versions of .NET ever since like .NET Framework 1.1. In .NET 7, we introduced the count method. And so before that, people were, to figure out how many times a regex matched in something, they would call matches, which computes all the matches, returns a collection of them, and they would access the count off of that collection. Now that we have a count method, again, it's just a one-for-one replacement of using that. But this one would be conditioned, obviously, on having that symbol.
Right. But yeah, same argument, right? You don't have access to the collection, so pretty easy to reason about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Would we not do it as the same analyzer?
We could.
Same
I expect it would end up being in the same analyzer. I was assuming we'd have a different diagnostic ID, but if you think the same diagnostic ID would make sense, that's fine too.
Because I think it would be a diagnostic of there's a
simpler way of expressing this.
Yeah, a simpler way of even if we limit it just to the regex things, there's a simpler way of expressing your regex.
Yeah, that's fair.
Usage.
I have no qualms with using the same diagnostic ID.
Same diagnostic
The only
ID.
reason I could think of that someone would want to say they want them split out differently is one of them is all versions and the other one is, well, I'm using this because I multi-target and I don't feel like having pound diff.
Sure.
Then don't multi-target. So I'm good either way.
But you would get that for free, right? If the analyzer would basically condition it on the thing, then
the problem is multi-targeting, where if you multi-target both net standard and say .NET 7 or .NET 8 now, you'll get an analyzer warning for regex.matches.count. But in order to fix that warning, you'd have to if-def because you couldn't write the fix in net standard.
But what's the behavior right now? You basically get the diagnostic in one leg, and then the fixer is invoked in that thing. So then it basically immediately creates an error on the other side. Is that what happens?
Right.
Gotcha.
And it would be, I want to fix all the ones for IsMatch because I can fix that everywhere. But I'd rather have. Yeah, I don't care about this one enough to switch it, so I just want to turn the diagnostic off.
Unfortunately, we currently lack the tooling feature that I think would be nice, which is get all the diagnostics, and if you get the diagnostic in one TFM and not in the other, then suppress it in all of them. But we lack that capability.
Right. And I mean, if we use the same ID, does it impact fix all? Is fix all predicated on having the same ID, or is it the same kind of instance of the thing you're invoking it on?
Fixers are based on ID.
So that means if we give you the same ID, if you do fix all, it will always do both of them.
Yeah, now the fixer does get the opportunity to then still inspect what it was given, so it can kind of suppress itself once it's invoked, but it's not ideal.
Right, so that would just, address the problem that, one of this wouldn't show up unless you have the symbol defined, right? But that still has the same multi-targeting problem as before. Yeah, I don't know.
I think I'm convinced different IDs is better.
I was about to say, I don't actually care. I think the fundamental problem is not an ID problem; it's a multi-targeting problem. And if you do a fix all, I don't know. It does seem to me that if you do one of them, you kind of want to do all of them. So I don't know whether you would have. Oh yeah, I want to do the count thing, but I don't want to do the other thing, because it still depends on what you're targeting, right? If you're, it may or may not work. So I actually don't care. I think to me, both choices are reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, different IDs means somebody who's targeting only net new has to hit fix all twice. And if it's the same ID, then we make it possibly more complicated for multi-targeting people, and split feels more flexible, and we get to share the code because we just get to say we register the analyzer with two possible diagnostic outputs, and if the next proposal is a third one, then we add a third one.
Sure. I mean, as I said, I don't care enough.
Fair enough. And I don't really care either way either. I think I'd moved myself to 51-49 in favor of split. So whatever you feel like doing, Steve.
Okay.
All right, StringBuilder append.
Yeah, so again, this one shows up surprisingly frequently. People, I guess, don't realize that StringBuilder.append has an overload that takes string, comma, offset, comma, length. And so they append a substring rather than appending string, comma, offset, comma, length. And basically end up with an intermediate substring, an intermediate string being allocated if the substring was actually needed. So this is just a fixer that, or an analyzer that would flag one and transform it to the other. Now, there was a valid comment on this proposal, which is there is an overload of append, at least in .NET Core, that takes a span. And there's an analyzer that will already flag replacing substring in this situation with as span. The benefit of having this analyzer is there's an overload of StringBuilder that works on every version of .NET. Technically, it might be like a tad faster, but I have not actually measured. The downside is if you have this pattern, you'll start getting, and you're running on .NET Core, you'll start getting two analyzers triggering, saying, with one saying use as span and the other saying use the StringBuilder.append overload. Plus, obviously, more analyzers running. So I don't feel super strongly about this. On modern versions of .NET, you're already going to have an analyzer that basically fixes it. I was, in this particular case, I was looking at a code base that wasn't on .NET Core, and this was showing up all over the place.
So if you were running on .NET Core, what option would you prefer in your own code base? The one that does the as span or the one that does append with offset?
Personally, I would prefer the one that does append with the string, offset, and length, but that's personal preference. It's really 6 of one, half dozen of another. I like using the built-in functionality of the class wherever possible, and not having an intermediate step, but it's really...
It's funny.
I've not measured, but I doubt there's a significant difference.
It's funny because I was just thinking about that. I feel like in my own case, I would probably prefer the as span one just because it seems... Like for me, I would prefer if the individual elements are right for the StringBuilder are more self-contained and I can extract them to locals, for example. And then also can inspect them in the debugger, right? Like this, I don't know, I can see like the span one seems more what I would prefer, but like that's personal.
You could ask 100 intelligent people and they'd probably have, well, I'm not gonna, probably not more than 2 answers, but at least 2 answers.
But I mean, that kind of answers my question then, because I feel like if we believe this is a code style thing more than a correctness thing, then it does seem reasonable to have analyzers for both. And it's just like, well, pick the one you like. But pick one of the two, right? Don't leave it like it is, as it is right now.
Yeah.
Jeremy, what are your thoughts on that?
So I have a few thoughts. One is deciding how much we care in terms of effort for people who aren't using the latest and greatest.
Yeah.
The other is, given that calling the StringBuilder append overload that takes the offset and length is just a style preference over the as span, and the as span one already exists, I would say that this analyzer should not run if it thinks that the other analyzer is going to.
I don't know that it can know that.
I don't think that offering the 2 choices here is better enough to offset the confusion it causes.
Right. I mean, if I'm fine just saying, nah, we're not going to do this. I don't feel super strongly about it. It was coming up because I was spending more time in NetFX code, but yeah, I mean, yeah, this is not the thing that's going to turn NetFX code to be really fast.
So I think I'm inclined to not approve, just
That's fine.
because it's mostly benefiting things that we say people should upgrade off of. If I misunderstand our position, then I can be swayed.
I think that's fine.
Do we have the existing analyzer that will flag it as telling users append here has a span overload, so string substring can be as span instead?
Yeah, that one exists. There's an analyzer that looks for use of substring being passed to something that could also be span and recommends using as span instead.
Okay, so we already have an analyzer. It's just the preference of if users don't want as span, or
And
if users are down level frameworks, then they
right,
have a better
the
option.
down level thing it won't run.
Okay,
Right.
Okay.
Right, because it wouldn't see the append of read-only
Right.
span char.
Even if you have the system memory and you get package, it won't have the StringBuilder.append overload that takes a span.
Makes sense.
All right.
All right. This is a probably large discussion, but we have an hour, so
Yeah.
that's good. Okay, so ever since we introduced IAsync enumerable, we've been having discussions about LINQ with IAsync enumerable. And at the time we did it, we basically deferred LINQ implementation to being in the already existing effectively. There was already sort of an open source IAsync enumerable, and there was a System.Linq.Async for it in reactive. And we basically said, all right, that'll be the one. Like it'll unify with this, and we'll just do that. And it's a very successful package. It gets lots of downloads every day. But probably, several times a year since that happened, this has come up like, why isn't this in the core libraries? And there are a variety of things now that have kind of all happened at the same time to kind of make us strongly reconsider. First and foremost, the current maintainers don't want to maintain it anymore. We've been adding a whole bunch of LINQ APIs over the years. It hasn't been keeping up. And it's an older code base that's still in part largely based on continue with, and it's just not something that they're particularly excited to keep going with. 2, we continue to get requests for it. 3, IAsync enumerable has been taking off more and more, especially you can even see it in kind of more workloads with things like AI, where in .NET, streaming is represented as IAsync enumerable, when you're doing streaming with these LLMs. And that and other situations, we actually end up with more IAsync enumerable in our code base than we used to. Like system threading channels exposes IAsync enumerable, data flow exposes it and uses it, which means we're starting to see cases where system library, system.star or Microsoft extension star libraries would really benefit from being able to use LINQ over IAsync enumerable as part of their implementation or as use of those libraries. And we can't, we have tried to really avoid depending on libraries outside of the platform for libraries in the platform. So if something is in Net Core app, it can't depend on something else. But even something like, Microsoft extensions whatever, because we're of concerns about breaking changes in other libraries, we really try and be super thoughtful about what other libraries we depend on. And it'd be nice to be able to use LINQ over IAsync enumerable in these libraries. So all of that together. Oh, also, the existing System.Linq.Async has some interesting design choices when it comes to things like naming of the methods. Like methods are named select await with cancellation or something like that, rather than just, select. So this is one of the most recent issues that was opened about it, which is basically like, can we finally incorporate System.Linq.Async into the core libraries? Oh, the other thing is, because it has become so popular, people are not loving that they're carrying around the binary. Whereas if it was in their core app, it would just be part of the platform. So I'm inclined to say, yeah, let's do it. Let's bring it in, both into Net Core app and then as a NuGet package as well, kind of like, channels or system text JSON, whatever. So both is in platform and then also available down level. I basically created an implementation and to kind of suss out what issues there would be. For the most part, I just took the Linq APIs that we have today and did a one-to-one translation to what I thought the async equivalent should be. But there were a bunch of open questions that I came upon along the way where I made some decisions, but I'd like to discuss some of those decisions to see if other people agree. So first and foremost, there's the question of, should we do this? And if we decide to do it, then there are more fine-grained questions about choices that I made that I'd love feedback on whether I made the right choices or not. This is not 100% API compatible with the current System.Linq, System.Linq.Async. So the suggestion from the maintainers was use a different library name, like System.Linq.Async enumerable, which I think is fine, maybe even better. It still runs into the issue, though, that some of these APIs do have the same shape. And so when the existing System.Linq.Async cannot unify with this because it's not 100% identical. And if someone moves to .NET, say 10, if this ships in box in .NET 10, and they're referencing the existing package, they will likely start getting some ambiguity errors. And as part of their .NET 10 upgrade, they would need to resolve those ambiguities, basically delete their existing System.Linq.Async reference and switch things over to use the inbox version. So there's, even with a different package name, there's still a compat concern or issue. Before I keep going, any questions or comments?
I guess my question is mostly like, if you ignore the naming problems, for things that have the same name or shape, are you suggesting any observable behavior differences, or is it mostly about, oh, I didn't like the shape of the API?
I have kept, to the best of my knowledge, I've kept the System.Linq enumerable behaviors across the board. I literally copy and pasted the code and then made the tweaks that were necessary to get it compiling. So I'm sure there's probably some corner case things somewhere that I missed or whatever, but the behavior here is intended to be as close to identical as possible with the synchronous link over enumerables.
And then in terms of completeness, like, are you taking or suggesting to take most of it, if not all of it, just under different names, or are there certain scenarios that this library solves that you just don't want to have in the core?
So the existing System.Linq.Async is based on what was in Linq several years back. So it's missing some of the newer APIs. I've added those in. It had one, to the best of my knowledge, it had one additional API, which I included here, and that was a conversion from an IAsync enumerable to an IObservable, which seemed fine. And in order to say, like, yeah, you can ditch the quote-unquote old one and move to this, I included that to observable here. Otherwise, and also Linq had, in order to facilitate some of the decisions that I made, I added a conversion from an IEnumerable to an IAsync enumerable. So there's a two async enumerable for IEnumerable.
Gotcha.
Other than that, the method groups and squinting, the overloads, are the same as what Linq has. Now, I say squinting because there are obviously some differences with how you expose the async stuff. And one of our concerns at the very beginning of all, years ago, was the sheer explosion of possible overloads that you could have if you tried to accommodate all the various combinations. There's a join overload that has, that accepts an IEnumerable and has, I think, 4 different delegates that do different things, or maybe 5 different delegates that it accepts, and each of which could be async. So you end up with that you could have a synchronous or an async enumerable, a synchronous or an async first delegate. It's like you could have 16 or 32 different possible overloads for some of these methods. I've made choices to keep that really small. So basically, these are only extensions over IAsync enumerable. There's no extensions here other than 2 async enumerable. There's no extension here over IEnumerable. It's only over IAsync enumerable. And the 2 async enumerable basically exists in part to fill that gap.
Right.
So if you want to use async callbacks with LINQ, you'd say 2 async enumerable, and then you'd use these methods. I then also made the choice that I wasn't gonna, for things that accept multiple delegates, I was gonna do all sync or all async. So no, the first delegate is synchronous, the second delegate is asynchronous. There's one overload that's everything is func of input to output, and there's another delegate where they're all func of input to value task of output.
Gotcha.
But you don't get mix and matching. And those choices significantly reduce the number of overloads involved.
So then, is it then fair to say, like, the intent here would be, we functionally take everything that exists there, we make some editorial choices to align it with the rest of the framework, and we recommend people you drop the dependency on the existing System.Linq.Async in favor of the one that's built in. And on top of that, because these are all extension methods, they don't really change, the compositionality of your app, right? You can still exchange types because the core type is IAsync enumerable, and we're unified with that. That we kind of think of this as more an implementation level detail for the libraries to absorb or not absorb if they don't want to, right? But the people that don't want to, well, they would run into the issues you mentioned where, well, now you have 2 extension methods with the same name. The compiler can't tell you which one to use. So now you're stuck with either like using aliases or effectively, you just drop the package dependency, right?
Right.
I think that's fine. I think that, this is one of those few areas where doing effectively the copy paste is reasonable because it's just extension methods. And so long we basically saying we believe what we have is a superset of what they had and it's reasonable to migrate, I think that would be more concerned if we say, hey, we only take 1/3 of it. But in order to use that 1/3, you kind of have to drop the dependency of the rest or change this library to drop the 1/3 so it doesn't conflict anymore, right? But since we don't have that problem, I think that seems like a very fine plan to me.
Yeah, functionally, it's a superset. Overload-wise, I'm 100% sure there are places where you might need to say .to async enumerable or something like that.
I was more talking scenario. Like, I also feel like that, that was my other question. So assuming we had that in the platform, I know the compiler team is not exactly happy with their query comprehensions that they have, but would they?
They all just work.
So, they do work with query comprehensions?
What's on the screen works with query comprehension. I had to make some choices to support that, but yes.
Oh, that's cool. So then, if this complexity thing with the overload combinations, the compiler could decide to do this for you, then, right? Potentially. Yeah. So then, I think that's also reasonable.
But I don't know. The way that the way the language is defined or spec'd, it's spec'd in terms of just translating it to down to particular calls, and so technically the way it's spec'd, it still would have ambiguity issues. So I think the language spec would need to be somehow involved.
Yeah. Well, that's true in general with query comprehensions because there's some things that we just don't have syntax for that we would like to have syntax for. But that makes sense. In terms of community impact, just looking at how many commits they have. Just last year they had 10 commits. If you exclude markdown changes, it's probably more like 7 to 8. And there seems to be no substantial churn there. So I don't know. I don't really, as long as the maintainers, which I think isn't it just Clay at this point, or is somebody else maintaining that library?
No, there are several people that all the ones I'm aware of have expressed interest in us doing this.
Yeah, perfect. So if the maintainers are on board with this, if we think we have a reasonable story,
I wouldn't do it if we were doing something they didn't want us to do.
right.
In terms of the coverage space, Steve, I feel like Emma was asking how much coverage we have, or assuming that you copy pasted from their project, but I thought you said you copy pasted the synchronous enumerable.
I
And made
copy
them
pasted from
async.
us. So
Yeah.
I can't speak to places where there might be differences of behavior between this and the existing System.Linq.Async.
Okay, but
The intent of System.Linq.Async was that it had the same behaviors as System.Linq, but it's possible places things diverged, in which case it would diverge from this as well.
okay, but even though you started with our System.Linq enumerable, you think that you've covered at least all of the, you've covered 99% of the scenarios that the package is covering.
Yeah, in terms of APIs, there's I can double check, but the only API I saw that was there, naming aside, that didn't exist in System.Linq was the toObservable, which I added in here as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are other ones elsewhere in System Reactive, like the link over observables is System .NET Reactive has added a whole bunch of other specialized functions, and Eric was suggesting that maybe we'd want to bring some of those in, which I think would be fine in the future on a case-by-case basis, but I've kept this to be purely an enumerable to async enumerable shift.
Which I also think is reasonable. Like, I mean, if you know, it doesn't have to be 100%. It just has to be close enough that most people could drop the dependency. And then the rest can either decide to copy paste implementation or ask us to include it in the core, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, so ignoring all of this, so it would still be a separate module, right? We would not include it in the existing assemblies, right?
I would put it in System.Linq async enumerable, which would be both a DLL that was part of NetCore app and also a System.Linq async enumerable NuGet package. That's my proposal.
And then by extension, that would mean it's upgradable. Right? It's one of those oops that you could upgrade out of box, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's the other problem. Yeah.
As systems writing channels, system text JSON. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't want to expose it through Microsoft PCL async interfaces and just say if you get one, you get the other.
No. I'd like
I guess because that would break people who then hit the did you want aggregate async or aggregate async?
Yeah.
Yeah. I honestly like that plan. It's one of those, it seems. And then I guess the benefit for us is that, you know, we can leverage these methods in box, right? We don't have to do dances to avoid that. Yeah, I think the only sticking point probably for parts like Aspire is if we bubble it up, you know, what frameworks are we going to support with that? But, you know, given that we can make it an OOP, we basically have the flexibility to target as broadly as async enumerable is supported today.
Right.
So we couldn't make that much.
I think by default, we would just do the standard, you know, the down level things that we normally do. We do net standard 2.0, we do net 4.6.2, we do, and the last 2 or 3 releases of core is sort of our typical plan.
Yeah, something like that.
On the
yeah.
same plan as the other ones.
Exactly. So I mean, yeah, it seems like a good enough plan.
And you're going for DLL unification instead of type unification. So the net 10 implementation in the NuGet package will have code instead of say it type forward sound to the system. And then it's up to the NuGet package resolver to say you're referencing the same thing as the framework. I'm going to drop your dependency.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what we do for the other one. That's what we do for system text JSON, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's like a module level conflict resolution, right? Because inbox has the same assembly. The OOP has a higher version, so the runtime loads the one that is deployed with the app.
So doing the unification at the NuGet level, not at the type level with type forwards, which that's the easier way of doing the packages.
Yeah, I think in general, when you want a package that can upgrade inbox, I don't even think you can have type forwards.
If you do the type forward, doesn't that lock you into never being able to?
Exactly. So I think like you just fundamentally can't do that. So it has to be module level, otherwise bad things are going to happen. Ignoring NuGet, it's nothing to do with NuGet. It's just to do with the, where would the runtime load the type from, right? So I guess then the other question is, so you kind of said like once you put it in box, I mean, you already removed the API service a little bit. Do we do anything? Do we have any concerns regarding like linkability, trimmability? I don't know, a generic explosion. I know that Parallel Link had this problems. I'm not sure that this one has.
I'm sorry, I was typing. Say that again, Emo.
So like with Parallel Link, we had this problem at some point that was bad generic explosion for CodeGen. And presumably because you already did some trimming here in terms of API surface, you don't believe that exists, right? So if we put it in box, we can still produce reasonably sized native images for those things. And
yeah, my expectation is this will be very similar to what you get with the regular link, which isn't wonderful, but it's not,
terrible. The good old Chernobyl quote, not great, not terrible. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, we can either go, method by method or just.
I think it probably makes sense to go through my open questions first, and I can kind of explain some of the cross-cutting decisions.
Yeah.
So, naming. We have the age-old question of the async suffix. And there are basically 3 categories of link methods. There are the source methods, the producers like range and repeat, where they're static methods. They don't operate over anything that's being passed in. So when you access them, you're calling them on async enumerable dot, right? Then there are the transform methods, the one that take in an async enumerable and return an async enumerable, or you might take in multiple and return one. And then there are the syncs, like max and average, the ones that take an enumerable and return a value. And the decision that I've made here, which we can absolutely discuss and reevaluate, is I've only included the async suffix on the syncs. So you have select, but average async. And I did that for 2 reasons. The first is, if we want this to work with query comprehensions, we can't have an async suffix on the methods that would be used by the compiler because it expects very specific names: select, where, group by, join, etc. Those can't be select async, group by async, join async. So if we used async on those, we would still want to have non-async suffixed overloads of the ones that the compiler can use so that the compiler could use them. And so that's a pretty big reason. As long as I think it would be very confusing to have some of them, an overload of select and an overload of select async that are actually the same thing, but they're named differently. The other one is that you often end up with chains of these methods. Await for each var item in foobar async dot where dot select dot take dot whatever. And in those situations, the async suffix doesn't actually convey a ton of additional information because you already have something that says you're doing async as part of that expression. So you don't need the async dot async dot async dot async. But when you just go to await, you get an async enumerable, and then you call some method on it that produces a value: max async, average async, aggregate async, all async, any async. I felt that it was important that those have the async naming convention like every other async method that we have, where you await it to get a result. So I ended up, if you look at what's currently in the bottom of the screen, you can see that aggregate async and all async and any async, those all end in async, but aggregate by, which produces an async enumerable, does not have the async suffix on it. So that was my logic. That's how I ended up where I ended up for naming.
And to say that in a slightly different way, make sure that I have the pattern right. If you can await it, it ends in async, and if you can't, it doesn't.
Correct.
I honestly think that's completely fine. And it's also within the spirit of even link, right? Because you don't, like, nothing executes until you start pulling, right? So that's where the await keyword would come in terms of await for each, or in case of a scalar, you know, you get the scalar value out of it by awaiting it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That seems reasonable to me.
Sorry, can you scroll up a little bit? I don't remember what I have as my
Sorry.
list. That's right. Oh, so overload. So I already talked about this for the most part. I tried to reduce the overload explosion from what would have been like 500 overloads or something to, I think Link itself has something like 210 or 220, and here I have like 260 or something like that. So it's not a terrible explosion. It's basically the only extensions for the Link APIs. There's just, they're only over IAsync enumerable, and they I've used basically two standard forms. Whatever the link, the delegate was that's used by Link shows up exactly the same way. And then there's an overload where all of those, whatever functions it takes as an argument, there's an overload where they're all sort of the asyncified version, which means they return a value task of whatever the result was instead of returning, like, value task of T result instead of a T result. And they take a cancellation token argument. So if you, like, the very first two lines, the aggregate async lines at the top there, if you scroll a little bit to the right, if that's possible, can you go a little further, or does it not work?
It's but the asyncs always require the cancellation token.
Correct. Again, just to try and limit things, and when there are delegates, they're either all value task returning or they're all not value task returning. I haven't mixed and matched.
So, but like the first one here, you have mixed and matched.
No.
No.
There's
The
only
first one returns a scalar, and the second one returns a.
No. In the same overload. Like overloads.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I get you now.
Yeah. So pretty much every link method that took a delegate, at least one delegate, has an overload that takes the asyncified versions of those delegates.
Okay. So you always have a foo and foo async delegate option, but you've not done the combinatorics of, if I take a second argument, it's could be I async enumerable or I enumerable.
If you want to use async,
it was async enumerable all the way. Convert the I enumerable to I async enumerable.
Exactly. So you always have the escape hatch of going down to make everything async. If anything needs to be async, everything needs to be async, basically.
Yep.
Um.
So can I go ahead and ask about task versus value task?
Sure.
Task versus value task?
Yeah, in this particular case, I think value task makes sense. These are all, you're using language features, you're using await for each. I think the need to use something like continue with, or to store the result of one of these things directly into a dictionary, is so remote that value task makes sense. It's the more efficient option. And we don't have to worry about, the combinatorics of, oh, well, my delegate is being called a ton and it just needs to return value task, but the method is returning task. I think it just makes sense for the whole surface area to just be value task and say, don't use all the task specific stuff. If you need to, as task it.
And if somebody already has a converter method that would have been fine for select, but they're returning task instead of value task, they need to just lambda wrap it for the conversion.
Yep.
Of input set goes to new value task of existing function.
Yeah, if you use async await, you don't have to do anything special. If you don't, then you have to say new value task and wrap it around the task. And again, that just saves having to, again, effectively not quite double, but close to double the number of overloads.
Okay.
There's one specific place where I had to diverge from this, or where I diverged from this, and I don't know if I made the right call or not. And it's specifically with select many. So select many has overloads that return IEnumerables. It's a little bit further up. So it takes delegates. You know, the simplest delegate basically takes the input and returns an IEnumerable of T results. And so I think it's valuable. Following the standard pattern, we would have ended up with one returning an IEnumerable and one returning a value task of IEnumerable, which I don't think is the right answer for select many. I think you need to be able to return an IAsync enumerable in a LINQ implementation that's based around IAsync enumerable. So then you end up with three overloads, one that returns an IEnumerable, one that returns a value task of IEnumerable, and one that returns an async enumerable. That's where I landed. There are other options. We could say, we're just not going to allow you to return an IEnumerable. The downside of that is all of our standard collections are IEnumerables, and so it's pretty common to want to just return a collection out of a select many. You'd have to call 2 async enumerable on each one to get that to work. Pranav had asked why not also have a value task of IAsync enumerable. I suggested that wasn't necessary because then you could just bake whatever additional asynchrony that was into the IAsync enumerable. There's some, I had to diverge from the pattern here. And so I just wanted to call it out because this seemed to make sense to me, but I could be convinced to say, you know what, just get rid of the value task IEnumerable in this case and only have the IEnumerable and IAsync enumerable, for example.
Yeah, why is the top sub method group only have 2 of your 3?
Why does the top sub method group only have 2
so
of the 3?
The overloads that just take source and produce result, as opposed to the ones that take source and the index and produce the result, you're missing the value task. Oh, it's because it's
just ordered
it
down
messed
at the
up
bottom.
the sorting. It's the bottom of the stack. Okay.
Sorry, this
Never
is
mind.
how Gen API, this is the order Gen API produced. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I think because it thinks that keywords sort, because it's a lowercase I for int, because it's a keyword, so it's better than cancellation token.
I see.
I think it's just sorted
Is
by
my guess.
text, yeah.
Yeah.
It basically sorts, I think, by number of arguments, and then the rest is just text-based. Yeah.
For the value task of IEnumerable returning for the func, I'm assuming people would use that as a lambda, right? So
Right.
you have a lambda, and then you return back an IEnumerable.
Yeah, or more specifically, you'd return back like
Collection.
you know, an array.
A collection, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why I kept it, because it felt like a common enough thing. You want to call a, you know, download something and get the list of all the things, and then you return the list as a collection.
Yep.
Right. So wouldn't that be useful to have that overload for the first 2 overload kind of things, where it's T source to value task of IEnumerable as well?
But he has that. It's the 6th one.
I guess once you have an IAsync enumerable,
Oh,
you can
you
just
need
do the work as
cancellation.
part of the
Yeah.
IAsync
Okay.
enumerable.
So on this one, Steve, why would the one returning IAsync enumerable not want a cancellation token?
It's a good question. The IAsync enumerable, its get async enumerator accepts a cancellation token. Oh, so actually, before we get to that, we probably need to talk about cancellation tokens in general.
Okay.
So let's put a pin in your question. We'll come back to when I talk about cancellation token.
Sounds good.
I mean, but to your earlier question, Stephen, I think that makes sense to me because, yeah, select many is kind of special. So deviating from the pattern to absorb most commonly used operations makes sense. I mean, it would be pretty terrible if you couldn't do half the stuff you have on screen right now.
Yeah, I think that the, like, you know, the download async returning the byte array, and that you want to select many of bytes or whatever, like, that's a terrible thing and you shouldn't do it. But that pretending that you had a parsing structure over top and you're doing a JSON list as value task instead of ISync enumerable. That makes sense to me that you would say, I want you to go call this thing that I already wrote, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about cancellation token. I think that's the next thing on the list anyway. Close to it. We'll talk about it first. So similar to naming, there's a question here about do you accept cancellation token into everything? Async enumerable accepts the cancellation token into the get async enumerator call. And as part of this design, as part of our guidelines for async enumerables, there's like an optional consider accepting a cancellation token into a method that produces an async enumerable. And the reason it's optional is because you don't actually need to bake the cancellation token into that returned async enumerable because it's passed into the creation of the enumerator. So if I have a foobar method that produces an async enumerable, I don't need to give the cancellation token then. I can give the cancellation token later when I call get async enumerator on the enumerable. And as a result, we have a with cancellation method where you can have a whole string of, you can have some async enumerable returning method and then dot off of it and say with cancellation and pass the cancellation token there, because you're just, at that point, you're just saying, okay, whenever you call get async enumerator, I'd like you to use this cancellation token. And this is relevant because if you have, await for each var item in blah.select.where.take.skip. Whatever, I probably should have slipped the order of some of those things. Do you want to pass cancellation token into all of those methods? Or do you want to pass it once with just a with cancellation and have it threaded through all of them?
Is task of async enumerable common? Like, it seems like it might be
task of async enumerable?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you could avoid it, like, and write a translation, but is it a thing people do?
Yes, it's a thing people do. But
not in these APIs. Okay, I was just curious, if we could provide some general guidance, like never pass it to anything that ever returns async enumerable. Sorry, I was just trying to.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
No, I mean we have plenty of times where we have async enumerable returning methods in the core libraries that accept a cancellation token, but it's there for more convenience. And my concern with doing it here is, which, to be clear, we could add. If you scroll down, you'll see that all the methods like select, where, take, skip, none of those accept cancellation token to the method itself. The callbacks take it, and the sync methods take it, like max async, average async, they all take a cancellation token. But I've left cancellation token out of the transform methods, select, where, aggregate by, etc., basically suggesting that if you want to pass a cancellation to those, you do it when you do the iteration, when you call with cancellation, or you call get async enumerator and you pass the cancellation token there. There's an argument to be made that I made the wrong choice here, and we should still optionally allow you to have a cancellation token in all the places, and then it's up to the caller. Do I want to pass a cancellation token everywhere, or do I want to use with cancellation to just do it in one place? We could do that. If we do that, I think we also need to invest in fixing our analyzers, because the moment we do that, analyzers are going to warn that you have a cancellation token and you're not passing it to all the places you need to pass it. So we're going to need to enlighten our analyzers about with cancellation and friends, which we should probably do anyway. But,
right.
So
yeah.
To me, the thing. So I'll admit I haven't ever used async enumerable, but I can imagine that if you're doing something like a web API and you have you're going to call a search thing, and it's going to give you paginated results, that you may have the search async and that would actually return a task of IAsync enumerable because it doesn't have the beginning of the enumerator until it comes back with the first page. And it's looking for, do I throw because I can't even start because you didn't give me the right arguments, etc. So I do see the things that return an async enumerator doing so in terms of a task. It does seem possible.
Right, but that
so
would be easier for an analyzer to see, like, oh, if it's a task of IAsync enumerable, whereas that may be change behavior. But I guess it doesn't.
But that's going to
really
go for when we're
looking
looking at the callbacks, where it's things that return an IAsync enumerable of should we overload those to say that they also we let them do a task or value task of IAsync enumerable and take a cancellation token, because the ones that are producing a late IAsync enumerable would want to be canceled.
So I just want to be very clear, though, that I think you guys are currently talking about the delegates, and for the most part, for right now, I'm just talking about the top level methods.
Right. So on that same vein, I feel that the things that are not doing work ahead of time don't need the cancellation token. Like if it's just wrapping in the operation, I know what I'll do when you call move next async.
Right.
And I think that's what select is doing. Right. So I sort of think it's correct to say we're indicating to you, you can't cancel the beginning of select. You can only cancel the moving forward. So I think it's fine to not have select take the cancellation token and just let it be the iteration based one that comes with cancellation.
And mind you, like, you're going to call move next async like pretty quickly most of the time. I guess you don't have to, but like,
I mean, the 99% cases you're using this within a wait for each, where it's the very first thing you're going to do.
So if we ignore all of the delegates right now, I think what you've chosen is correct.
If we did take a cancellation token as a method parameter for these linked methods, I presume we would just link them with the one that you pass in via?
Yeah, that happens automatically by iterators. So when you write an async and an IAsync enumerable iterator method, using the yield return and await, if you attribute your cancellation token argument as with the attribute enumerator cancellation, then the compiler recognizes that can come from two different places. It can come from actually calling that method directly. You pass in the cancellation token, and it can come from when someone calls get async enumerator on the IAsync enumerable return from that iterator. A cancellation token can be passed in there. So the compiler generates code that handles both of those cases, including when they're not the same. So it's got a condition that basically says, if I got a non-default token from one but not the other, if I got one from neither of them, then there's no cancellation. If I got one from one but not the other, use it. If I got one from both and they're the same, just use it. If I got one from both and they're different, use cancellation token source dot create whatever the method is to create a combined token for the two of them.
So is there any reason why I wouldn't want to put that attribute on my parameter?
No.
Yeah. And then my last question is like, when I don't take a cancellation token on my iterator, there's no syntax for me to access the one that was passed to the enumerator, right?
If you don't put the attribute on it, there's no syntax for it. The attribute is how you get access to the cancellation token passed to get async enumerator.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, exactly. So then, is it then fair to say like the general pattern is if you write an iterator, you probably should take a cancellation token?
Yes.
If you want to use that compiler feature, but like this won't, right? Like if we go with the proposal, we'll do something else.
Will. Like none of these public APIs are iterators. They use iterators in its implementation detail.
Yeah,
I see.
But they're forward to them, right?
They use iterators, but they just don't pass.
Yeah. So like if you look at my branch, a method like all async it has the outer. All async is a bad example because it doesn't return async enumerable. Select. So the public select API doesn't use async, right? It does argument validation. and then it delegates to an async iterator, which does take a cancellation token that's attributed as a numerator cancellation, and the cancellation token passed to the getAsync enumerator will then be fed in there by the compiler. Does that make sense?
I think so. So in the public method, you're calling an iterator without an explicit cancellation token, but because there's an attribute on the cancellation token parameter, that will get filled in by the compiler with the getNext cancellation token.
And that's all just implementation. I mean, I could do that myself without using the compiler feature. It's just a lot of code.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I think without makes sense. I mean, in theory, you could always add the cancellation tokens overloads later, though I'm sure you wouldn't want to.
So this then gets to Jeremy's question from earlier when we were back on select many, and he was asking why the func of tsource to IAsync enumerable didn't take a cancellation token. And the answer is it doesn't need to, because the cancellation token gets threaded through to the getAsync enumerator on the IAsync enumerable that's returned from that func.
So there's actually one case maybe where if someone writes a generator or an IAsync enumerator or enumerable, that they might want to have a cancellation token optional that wouldn't bind to this func.
I mean, there are lots of things that wouldn't bind to this func. It would be.
Yeah, they could wrap it. That's fair.
Yeah. The only place that it would break down is if they had a method producing an IAsync enumerable that took a cancellation token and ignored the cancellation token passed to its getAsync enumerator, and that would be a very non-standard and arguably buggy IAsync enumerable implementation.
And for these funcs that return an IAsync enumerable and don't take a cancellation token, you could do like the same trick that you basically did, where you have a method that doesn't take a cancellation token call a generator that has an attribute parameter. That'd be like the easy way.
It didn't fully follow that, but I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, my cancellation token argument from the delegate is more, what if you're trying to cancel the operation that would produce the async enumerator? And that makes me think more that maybe if we're concerned about things like the late bound, the server has to tell me if my search request is valid or not. That means that we would not want to just put cancellation token, comma, IAsync enumerable. That would be cancellation token, comma, task or value task of IAsync enumerable, which is the late bound. I will have an enumerable or I won't, but give me a minute.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to how important is it for that to be external to the IAsync enumerator versus the first turn of the crank on the IAsync enumerable or IAsync enumerator. Like you can get a lazily produced IAsync enumerable for anything, and then it's the first time you call move next on it that it tries to talk to the server and determines that it can't do the thing. So
right, I just don't know what the prevailing design suggestion behind IAsync enumerable methods are. Of like, is task of IAsync enumerable considered an anti-pattern, or is it considered this totally makes sense in like 80% of the time?
My philosophy has thus far been that task of IAsync enumerable is an anti-pattern. I don't think we'd ever expose, separate from what we're talking about with like, I don't think we'd ever expose a method in the core libraries that returned a task of IAsync enumerable.
So you think the server rejecting your argument should be manifest in the first iteration of for each, instead of that it returns you, instead of it throws an exception instead of returning you a search state?
Yeah, well, if for no other reason, then it's hard to compose.
Yeah.
So argument validation will throw during the first call to move next async. Is that the argument? Can't
server side valid. So like, you should throw the hey argument null exception
right
in the call. But if the server is like, wait a minute, you didn't give me null, but I don't accept the empty string, or you gave me a string that only contains white space and the client didn't check that, and like, no, That's going to come back. Apparently, Steve wants that to come back in the first call to move next.
I see. Or like whatever, if you're hitting a backend that's returning server side events and gives you like
rate limit exceeded, access denied,
or
etc.
whatever.
Now that said, like there are very, very few methods in this whole proposal that fit this pattern. I think it's just select many, that where there's a delegate that returns an async enumerable. Maybe there's one more somewhere, but I'd have to go look. So if we're really worried about it, like I would be fine adding the one more overload for select many that completed squared the circle or circled the square or whatever the right terminology for it is. Because it's not a pervasive thing that's going to lead to just a ton of stuff being added everywhere. I just don't know that it's meaningful.
So that's in the API as proposed, right? The yeah, okay.
Oh well, wait, in the API as proposed, there's no delegate that's returning value task of async enumerable.
Oh, I see. I see. Select many func of t source of int cancellation value task. Oh, enumerable. Sorry.
Yeah. So you can the late bound synchronous enumerable, but not a late bound async enumerable.
Right, and in that case, it's because the synchronous enumerable does double duty as as one of our core representations of arbitrary collections, which is why I special cased that. But I mean, even for that one, we could say, you know what, screw it, we're not going to have that, or we
turn
could
it into an async enumerable. No,
yeah.
So if
one of the
something
challenges here, and I'm hopeful in the future we'll address it with additional language work, but today you can't write an async. You can't write a lambda iterator, async or not. So it requires a little bit of extra code to separate something out into a separate local method.
Which, I mean, if you're not gonna have a cancellation token in the signature anyway, yeah, that'd be interesting. So in such a scenario, if you could do an async iterator in a lambda, that would bind to a func that didn't take a cancellation token, even if you had it in the parameter list. Does that make sense? So we have something, right? So like, let's say that I'm trying to write a func of t source async enumerable using a lambda, assuming that async iterators and lambdas were supported. Like, would I be able to add a cancellation token parameter to the lambda? And even though like the func of t source async enumerable isn't asking for it, does that make sense?
Sorry, I'm being dense, Stefan.
Maybe I'm just being confusing. So assume that I'm calling a method that takes a func of t source async enumerable t, right? And then I'm writing a lambda using the not yet existing async iterator lambda support.
Yeah.
In such a world, even though I'm targeting a func of t source async enumerable, could I add a cancellation token parameter?
In such a world, I would probably not, because it would still need to bind that iterator would still be lowered to a method that accepted a cancellation token, and it wouldn't bind to a delegate that didn't accept one.
Yeah,
so if we think that were to happen, that'd be a reason to have it as an explicit parameter, right? Like if we thought that people were going to be writing lambdas for this, and that's
I think that's the same argument as like when someone creates a generator not as a lambda, as like a normal method, and they want an optional enumerator cancellation attribute, and that would have the same issue.
That's fair, yeah, because otherwise you have to write the wrapper. And there's like the discoverability argument. I was on the no cancellation token parameter side, but maybe for the func.
But the issue is that this func wouldn't bind to the definition of select many because it has an optional parameter.
Like, Yeah,
I mean,
the
you'd have to-
optional cancellation token wouldn't bind unless you had an
Yeah.
explicit cancellation token parameter. Yeah.
I mean,
in
you'd have
the
to pass
definition,
the.
right?
You'd have to specify the argument list to indicate you wanted to get rid of the cancellation token, but that's
You want to keep the cancellation token, I'm assuming. Here.
then you'd have to do it with a capture. So like in your example where you had to specify the parameter list that I goes to repeat of I, you would do I goes to repeat of I comma token, and you've now passed a token, but it required doing a capture instead of a stateless delegate.
I see a token. Yeah, the token would come from outside.
Yeah.
But in that example,
I mean,
also,
that wouldn't
you don't
allow
also, I mean,
linking, right?
that example you posted, Pranav, you don't, I guess I'm not clear on the concern in that example because the token still ends up inside your repeat iterator. It's just passed in. Like select many is going to call get async enumerator on what was returned from repeat and pass in its cancellation token.
The issue there is just that the select many wouldn't bind, like it wouldn't compile, right? Because
Why won't it compile? The way
sorry.
you've written, why won't it compile?
That would compile. Repeat by itself
Yeah.
wouldn't, right? If you just passed repeat by name.
Yeah,
Right, but what's
yeah,
written
so-
here would.
But then repeat gets lost, right? The cancellation gets lost.
No, it doesn't.
Here.
The repeat here, the call to repeat is passing in default, but then the ISync enumerable
okay, yeah.
is returned to select many.
Yeah,
Get
and then
async
it gets
enumerator is
started
called
with
on
get
that, and the
enumerator.
token gets passed in there.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So I
Right.
think
So
all that's
this
being talked.
works, but are people going to expect that to work?
I mean, yeah.
I think this is reasonable that it doesn't include cancellation.
I think we could also add the overload in the future.
I think so. It's an incompatible
Yeah.
signature.
So I threw a thing into the chat. So I did find one example of somebody doing something like search async, where they were returning a task, and so if
Oh yeah, this pattern is from Azure where they want to return data.
they want to return the data
metadata.
and the answer.
Yeah.
Or they want the
Return-
data and the metadata.
Yeah.
So, but given that they have a search async that returns a task, if we don't add the select many that allows a func of ISync enumerable, and they have one, then I think they have to use sync over async to return it back.
No,
They can just do a wait that to
they would
async enumerable, right?
they would have an async enumerable.
They
would have
tell them to
func. They would use the func to ISync enumerable that would await, and that implementation that ISync enumerable iterator would await search async and iterate through the results, yielding them.
But that would require async iterators.
We have async iterators. What we lack is async
lambda iterators.
we lack
Yeah.
lambda iterators.
So
You'd have to,
they'd have to
write a local method.
So right, so they'd have to write so you tell them to write a local function to avoid the sync over sync over async in the middle. Okay, it's fair.
Now that said, if we're really concerned, again, I think it's just one overload. We could add that one overload. If it makes all of our concerns here go away, we could add a func of tsource cancellation token to value task ISync enumerable. Yeah.
We can add it later. We can see how much.
Yeah. I think that carries the day. Like, I'm not sure it's actually better, but it's the least committal. So yeah, we can add it later.
I know I'm the one who started the question. I am in general in favor of less is more. I just wanted to understand why we felt it was okay to go with less. So.
Okay. Well, if anyone has a strong argument, otherwise we can always, we can add it now. We can add it before we ship. We can add it in the future, I think.
We should be able to add it in the future unless it makes.
We'd want to double check it didn't cause ambiguities, but I think it would only cause ambiguities if something implemented both IEnumerable and IAsync enumerable, and that's pretty rare. All right. Keep going through the list. Okay.
You
next
had comparisons.
Yeah,
We
compares.
skipped that one.
So LdapSessionOptions was introduced before C# supported optional parameters. So LdapSessionOptions has a whole bunch of overloads, one of which doesn't take an iEquality compare or an iCompare, and one of which does. I've collapsed those down to just one that takes an optional compare, which I think in 99% of the cases just makes sense. There are a couple places where it makes things a little bit awkward. In particular, if you want to pass a cancellation token to something like, what's a good example? Like aggregate, I think aggregate async is one that takes both a comparer. No, aggregate wouldn't do that.
Max async.
Thank you. Yeah, would take both a compare and a cancellation token. You want to pass the cancellation token, you need to either name the cancellation token or you need to specify null or default or something for the compare. There was also one place, because of wonkiness with how apparently, like, there was the C# compiler has a known deviation from the spec in a particular corner case, and because of that, I had to, for one or two methods, because of the overloads exposed, I actually had to have the two separate methods, one that took a compare and one that didn't. I think it might actually be max and min async. I have to go look and see.
Yeah, sorry. Why was that again? I was going to ask. Why? Because that's the only one where it's not default.
Because there are a couple of the methods, the other overloads. There are some generics that are otherwise ambiguous. Because of the default for the comparer, I can look up the example and paste it. I had to ask the C# compiler team about it, and then they went to figure out if it was a bug or not, and it turns out it was like a 15-year-old by design thing. Let me look up the example after, and I'll share it. But basically, otherwise you get ambiguities if you don't specify the comparer or the token.
Okay, yeah, sounds reasonable.
And I only hit it because I was writing tests for all the methods, and some of them weren't compiling. So that's the decision I made there. We could, of course, split them again, but I think it makes sense to not to, and just accept the fact that in some of these places you might need to specify, name your cancellation token or explicitly specify the compare parameter.
Yeah, I think if we get, again, the usability feedback that people are getting frustrated with the consequence of the two optionals, and then we can add the one promoting
one of the optionals. We would just make the current one non-default, non-optional, and add one that didn't take one. Is that right?
Yeah, and then we would just plummet through to call the long one anyway.
Right.
Presumably.
Yeah.
And I assume we're at the level of you're using LdapSessionOptions, so I don't care that this means that we made iEquality comparable or whatever. iEquality comparer stay in your closure even if you never actually used it for AOT.
We've never cared about that with the built-in link, where
sure,
the one that doesn't take a compare just delegates to the one that does. So I don't think we.
Yep. Okay. I just know we've hit the.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair. This is already.
We hit the things where we started saying, oh, just make a thing optional with like 700 parameters, and
right.
And then we hit like, well, actually, the implementation that only took 2 parameters was simpler and pulled a bunch of things out of the type closure. So let's go ahead and add it back. So I'm just asking questions.
Yeah, no, it's good questions. Okay. Then there were a few things where I removed some overloads, in particular min and max. I think we later added a generic, but I think at the beginning there was no generic, and it had. I don't know why this doesn't show up for the other ones as well, but like for sum and average and whatnot, maybe because of generic, maybe because of iComparers, but basically we have a generic that now completely suffices, and we don't actually need the non-generic specific ones. Like there's one for int, double, float, long, decimal, int, nullable int, nullable double, nullable float, etc. I just removed those because they don't actually add any value.
You say that, but they're still there in the code listing, so I'm confused by that.
They are?
Yeah, but you look some max async, that's the one that returns decimal, that's one that returns double, that's one that returns int. That's why I'm...
In Steve's proposal?
Like literally in this thing here, yeah. So scroll down here. Here we go. There's all the max buys. There's all the min buys.
There's a comment below. Is that more up to date?
You're gonna make me go look.
So I would agree with that assessment, by the way.
I'm gonna go need to compare and see what I was talking about.
But I mean, I would say like, yes, I think that seems like a good plan in the general goal of reducing surface area that is unnecessary. That seems like a good plan.
It's possible I just didn't delete them, or it's possible I'm referring to something more specialized, or it's possible. It's also possible there were actually more overloads here. Oh, yeah. I'll double check, but I'm 99% sure. Actually, let me just double check the docs for link. I think it's the ones that are the selector ones. Yeah. So if you look at link, Max has a method that's IEnumerable of t source, and then there's an overload where there's a func from t source to int, an overload where there's a func from t source to decimal. Those aren't necessary.
Interesting. Do you know why they were there in the first iteration?
I think the generic one wasn't there. I think. Well, now that I say that, let me see if I can find the generic one in the docs and see when it was introduced. Yeah,
I guess
well, I'm not sure.
The
I actually don't know.
archaeology isn't probably necessary. It seems like, yeah,
maybe for consistency, I don't know.
Again,
But
you could add it
always add
later.
them. It just didn't seem to be necessary.
Yeah.
So why do we?
Kind of late. Oh, sorry. One question, and if we haven't gone over it yet, then just skip past it. But did we discuss the I ordered async enumerable type yet?
We have not yet.
Okay, sorry. Moving on.
Yeah, I feel like we only need 2 maxes.
Um,
The one that takes the selector func and the one that does not.
we don't. There's no max that doesn't take a selector that's generic, is there?
No, but like, why can't we have a min async of t that takes an async enumerable of t, where t is constrained to be, I don't know, whatever the constraint is to produce a min or a maximum, right?
Comparable.
We would be diverging even more. We would be introducing a generic that Link doesn't have.
And it would differ in behavior because the behavior for min and max for float doesn't match the default behavior of min and max for math, or technically doesn't match any of the other overloads that we expose for math either, between max number, min number, min magnitude number, max magnitude number, etc. The link min max is entirely unique, and I don't think we can fix it due to backcompat issues.
Yeah.
Depending on how divergent it is, we could say that, well, this is one place where async enumerable diverges. But that would be up to you, Tanner, I think.
I think it'd be pretty weird if enumerable.max and enumerable.to-async enumerable.max gave a different answer.
Yeah, and if we were to fix it so that we had a generic overload that was I-comparable or something like that, then I'd want it to do the right thing. And maybe the solution there is that you have min async that is, and it's a little bit weird, but maybe the fix there is you have a generic one for most types, and then we have min async that takes float and double for compat, and we tell users the generic version versus the non-generic version, one differ, use the concrete one if you want the old behavior, use the generic one if you want explicitly, if you want the better behavior.
I mean, that's what the compiler will pick.
That also suggests, I need to go back and check why I thought it was okay, but the ones that I removed because there was already a generic for it, technically it would be changing. I think it would probably be changing that behavior because effectively they behave, the ones that take a selector behave as if you first produced all the values with select and then you called the non-selector version. So it's possible by removing those overloads, I actually introduced the discrepancy into the one you're talking, the one we were just talking about.
Which would be that foo.select with your transform.max would give a different answer than foo.max with the transform.
Right.
Yeah. Do we need max with the transform?
I mean,
is there a reason that we
I
don't
kept
just make
it
it go through
purely
select?
for compat with, or for, you know, copying all the things from LdapSessionOptions and bringing them over. It would certainly delete a lot of code if we didn't have those.
I just wonder why System.Linq.Enumerable has them in the first place.
Someone thought it was valuable back in 2005.
Yeah, it feels like it's entirely redundant with select.
It is. They're all implemented as enumerable.select.max.
I'm looking at System.Linq.Enumerable max of T source.
You look at .NET
or with
framework.
a T source and oh, sorry.
They've been optimized in .NET Core for, you know,
Gotcha.
real or not real reasons, but the implementations in .NET Framework and the ones that I have in async in the async enumerable one are all literally enumerable.select.max.
Yeah, so maybe we just cut those and again see if people complain.
So which one do you want to cut? There's so many variations here that I lost track in my head. Which ones are you talking about?
You're saying everything that takes a selector.
The min and max that take a selector.
The min max that take us
some.
Sure. I mean, yeah, all of the things that take a selector is the argument to their sync. It feels like you should just call .select first. Especially if that's what the implementation is doing.
What my implementation is doing right now. In a bunch of places, I opted for simplicity over hyper optimization.
Mm-hmm. Start with correct.
Okay.
I think I've never used the one that take a selector, to be honest.
It's like the implementation we have in core where it isn't using the select iterator in the middle might be slightly more efficient because it's not creating another instance, but again, you're using link.
Well, this method would make so much more sense if it would return T source, right? Because then it's like you say min according to, like, you know, customer.age, but you want to get the customer.
That's what the min and max by methods we added do.
Yeah. But that's why I don't even understand what the original methods were supposed to do.
Yeah, the buys where you want the criterion key to be different than your result makes sense. They have to take the selector.
If we want to, I mean, if we're willing to reevaluate overloads and say these overloads just don't make sense and just add them back later if we want to, I'm fine with that. I would do it consistently across all the min, max, average, sum, etc.
So this brings an interesting question from chat. So, like, assuming we have this entire surface area, are we, like, EF supports link, right? Well, will they eventually support IAsync enumerable baking data stores as well or not?
I think you need to ask Shy.
Because, I mean, that might be a reason to keep some APIs for query rewriting purposes, right? So that, you know, the trees are somewhat uniform. But other than that, yeah, I would say, like, I mean, given that it's early for .NET 10, I'm inclined to say let's just start with what we think the minimum set should be. And we can always add. I mean,
Yeah. If we're concerned that our implementation of, max of float and or nullable float are wrong, then keeping those specific overloads so that they get to keep doing what they've been doing with synchronous link makes sense.
right.
But I think we can try dumping the max with a selector.
Okay.
Which is, again, different than max by. But I don't think we have any value in having max async of long, because I don't think we have any problem where we ever sort long differently than someone would expect. So
But we would need to add another overload that doesn't exist, but sure.
Fair enough. I guess I'm surprised that nobody has wanted max of their arbitrary comparable or comparable.
Or maybe
whichever
there
language I
actually
feel
is
like
one
speaking.
now. Hold on, I might be talking crazy. Hold on. I think we ended up adding.
Because your first generic one there,
Yeah,
which
okay.
is the source and the optional comparer.
Yeah, though you're right. You're right. That would handle it.
Yeah.
We would still need the one for float and double if we wanted to maintain behavior.
Right.
And it would mean we would very clearly need to document that there's a functional difference between max of I async enumerable of float and max float async enumerable of float. Like if you explicitly specify the generic type parameter, you get different behavior.
Yeah. I mean, we could make that be not true, but yeah.
Well, and the other consideration which might be relevant as part of exposing it is there's a difference between iComparable and something that's iNumber, for example, because iComparable follows the sorting rules that's required for hash sets and collections and lists. And therefore, for example, nan has a sort order, whereas something like iNumber follows the type rules. It's the same issue that we have with operator equals versus dot equals. So if we expose iComparable, then we can't also expose without a different name something that works for numbers, if that was a relevant consideration.
Error. Yeah. My statement concretely is the decimal, I assume decimal, int, long. Yeah, the decimal, the int, and the long, and the nullable versions thereof of max async can be dropped in favor of the max async of t source that takes an enumerable of source and a iComparer of t source.
We could drop the other ones too if we want and just say if special case t source equals float and t source equals double when there's no comparer.
Yeah, and the compare is null. I guess that's true. We could hide the special casing in the impl instead of in the signature.
Tanner, how do you feel about that?
I think that one would be fine. It would stay compatible. We still couldn't accelerate float and double for custom compare though. If the user wanted to follow the behavior of like
I don't know that we can accelerate anything anyway. We have to assume that the two values come, 20 or 30 minutes apart. They're not going to be nicely lined up in a vector register.
Oh, right, because it's async, so we can't do the span optimizations at all. So, yeah, so then I think that's completely fine.
All right, let's just assume we're going to collapse them all where it makes sense.
Okay.
We're also out of time and over time, and we haven't fully gone through all the open questions. Should we pick this up next time?
I mean, we can. I also have time to cover the rest if people want to. Depends on you guys. I think it might make more sense. to finish it up so we don't have to page in a bunch of context next time again.
I can continue for a while.
All right, let's do that. All right. I can fix this up after with what it will actually look like, but basically all these things combine into a single min max, and the same, however it makes sense for average and, well, average and sum are different. That needs more than a compare. That would need generic math, and I think we want to avoid that for because we want this to work down level with the same signatures, but we could get rid of the selector one still.
Yeah. I agree. Some would need to be overloaded across all the types that we intrinsically know how to add, and then, but we don't need some that takes a selector func.
And we have some open issues about adding generic math APIs to Link. I think System.Linq.Async enumerable would just join. You know, we'd start saying anything we add to enumerable we add here as well.
Yep. Which in general means we would now be adding it in 3 places. Enumerable, queryable, in here.
Yeah, and we have an open issue about whether we should also be doing it for plink, which we haven't.
Fair enough.
We're really good at accumulating this stuff. Okay, so the only 2 APIs that don't show up in link to enumerable that I've added here are 2 async enumerable that takes an IEnumerable and 2 observable that takes an ISync enumerable. There are a bunch of other possible interesting async focused APIs we could want to add, but I've only added the ones here that were sort of foundational. The 2 async enumerable is important for if you want to, if you have an IEnumerable, but you want to be able to use async delegates, then you need to be able to call all these methods on it. And so you call 2 async enumerable first. Initially, I had it as async enumerable, but I renamed it because it felt more like we are legitimately creating something new. We're not casting. Let's see. The other one other interesting tweak that I had to make is of type and cast are the 2 methods on enumerable that actually operate on the non-generic IEnumerable. Right? They take in a non-generic IEnumerable and produce a generic. There's no non-generic IAsync enumerable. So the only way to do of type and cast are to have them take 2 generic type parameters, one for the source and one for the destination. I think that's still reasonably useful, especially for of type. Cast is a little strange, but it still makes sense. I just don't know how valuable it will actually end up being. But so basically those just now are, have a T source and a T result instead of just a T result.
I really wish that the language team would accept partially specified generics.
Yeah, it makes these weird it makes these strange that you can't right now.
Right, because you'd call foo enumerate, or you'd call enumerate foo async, and then dot of type foo comma derived foo, close angle paren.
Yeah.
Which it is like, I don't care what my from is. I want all the froms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think the last one is what to do with some of the special types. Stefan mentioned the I-ordered async enumerable. We can get to that in a second. I didn't list that here, but it's good to cover. But things like I-grouping, which I-grouping is really just an IEnumerable that adds a key property, if I remember correctly. But in all the places where we create one of these, we actually fully create the group before we yield it. So Eric was suggesting, well, should we come up with some other way of exposing this in a way that basically says, here's the I list of all of the elements rather than something that's less strongly typed as IEnumerable? Or conversely, should we have an I async grouping where even though we've you wouldn't actually be accessing it in an async manner. Like make it consistent with the rest of the APIs and have it be an async enumerable. Right now, I just have it using iGrouping, and similarly iLookup for the lookup APIs. But we could tweak it. I think Eric had suggested instead of returning an iGrouping, return a key value pair of T key, comma, iList T result. I lean towards just keeping it the same as what we have with enumerable, but I could be convinced.
I mean, group by is eager, right? Doesn't it have to drain the entire input anyway?
It's eager, but it's exposed as returning an enumerable of groupings. So but its eagerness is, well, it's lazy in that it doesn't happen until you call move next.
Sure.
But it's eager in that once you call move next, it does the full computation. And so the grouping that you get back, even though it's an enumerable, it actually knows it knows the number of elements, and it could support direct indexing. In fact, in .NET Core, what we give, the iGrouping we give back also implements iList. So if you know that, you can cast.
I don't think we would say we want to fix group by here.
That's where I was leaning as well, which is why I kept it using iGrouping, but it was valid feedback that I wanted to surface.
So I assume it's returning value task of iGrouping, and that it's
an async. Can you scroll down? I think it's an async enumerable of iGrouping.
I assume it'll be under G.
Yeah, goodbye. Yeah.
Right, so is this one, wait, how's it async enumerable of
No,
T
it's the overload above.
Oh yeah, this one here, yeah. All right.
And then there are a few more above that, yeah.
But if these aren't actually transforms, these are actually sinks.
Well, they're structured in the API as if they're transforms. It just happens that the first time you call move next, it's like order by. The first time you call, order by is still producing an enumerable, but it does all the work the first time you call move next.
Yeah.
I'm just like, for the previous discussion of the sinks need cancellation tokens and the async suffix of like
logically from a code perspective, these are transforms. It's just the work isn't as spread out as it is in something like select or where. It happens earlier.
Fair enough.
Now we could actually, for something like async enumerable iGrouping, we could actually technically allow it to be lazier. You know, we can have a channel for each grouping that we fill as we iterate through it, and we're constantly adding more stuff into it, but it becomes super prone to deadlock.
Well, you have to enumerate the entire source before you complete the first group, right? Or, oh, I see, but you don't have to necessarily examine the entire group.
Every time you see a new distinct key, you're like, oop, another grouping came out with a lazy enumerator.
Right, and when you say prone to deadlocks, I assume in the consuming code. If the consuming
code
read everything simultaneously,
enumerates all the groupings, and for each grouping enumerates all the elements in it, unless you ended up with a very, very specific ordering of results, you would stop like pulling. Either you'd have to buffer the whole. Well, okay, let me rephrase. You would basically have to still buffer the whole input.
Or read everything in parallel. Yeah. and then maybe just.
But in order to do it in parallel, you'd have to buffer the whole thing, or you could deadlock. Because if you were depending on, if you had a bounded buffer, you could be enumerating the wrong thing and end up filling the buffer and not be able to get the next thing that would unblock the consumer. So
if you're reading it into a buffer. Right. If you're just like writing it to standard out, like reading everything in parallel would be enough. But like,
now that said, we're buffering everything anyway. So you could say, all right, well, just buffer, you'll be better off. You might as well just like maybe not buffer everything or maybe be able to make more forward progress before the whole thing is buffered. But it requires a whole bunch of complication and moving parts and expense under the covers to achieve that. And I'm not sure it's worth it.
What's the difference between group by and to dictionary?
To dictionary doesn't group. It creates you can have each value once you can have each key once.
Right. Okay. So this is to dictionary, key comma enumerable of t value.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Because I feel like group by is I grouping is one of those things that every time I try and use it, I end up deciding.
All I grouping is an enumerable that tells you the name of the group.
Yeah.
To be fair, to dictionary is usually the very next thing I call, because I don't want to have to deal with an I grouping. But yes.
Well, it depends whether you have multiple values per key. If you don't do that, then don't use group by in the first place. Yeah.
That's why it's the dictionary of list of element.
Then isn't that's what lookup is, right, Stefan? Am I?
Oh, you're right. Actually, you know what? I discovered lookup, and then I've been using that. But I used to use group by.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And this
and I probably would again if not reminded. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Pranav. What was the question?
I was just wondering if it could compose with select many, because if you have like a group of items, you might want to pass it to select many, and then
yeah, I grouping is IEnumerable,
like
so you can just do group by dot select many and return the group, and it'll flatten it out.
And then you're back where you started. It's a very expensive no-op.
Yeah. So just going back to the notion of the transforms, which I was thinking select and where, which are a simple piece of work every time they hit move next. But reverse and order by and grouping, they're not simple pieces of work. So do we like that they look simple but are actually not?
I mean, that statement is already true for enumerable.
Yeah, it's true for all LdapSessionOptions. I mean, that's the.
So, but I mean, the fact that like when you write, if you were to write the local ISync enumerable foo equal something dot group by, like it feels to me like, oh, I'm in async land. This hasn't done anything yet until I call move next, and it's like, actually, no, that just drained your entire thing.
Well, it's still, if you don't call move next, nothing happens.
Yeah.
So it's the moment you move next, that enumerable is when it does all the work. It's not doing all the work in the call to group by itself.
Correct.
No, it's all the work happens on first pull.
It's still lazy. It's just not as lazy.
Okay, then. Okay, so it is. You're back into a place where you could have passed in the cancellation token to your for each.
Yes.
Yes.
I guess really that's my concern. So all right, never mind. This is the simple operation of wrapping it in. I will do this work later.
Yes.
Yes.
there is one case that maybe having some kind of async enumerable would make sense for each group, where the result selector can be evaluated per element that in each group. I don't know how worth it is to have that.
Yeah,
so the behavior.
The challenge with that is, if again, I've been operating under the assumption that we want this to be functionally as close to the LdapSessionOptions enumerable as possible. If you lazily evaluate the result selector, then presumably you're doing it every time you enumerate. Whereas, like if I get the grouping, then I can iterate that grouping multiple times, and with enumerable, I'm just looping through an array of all the results. If you make the result selector lazy, then you either need to say that every time you enumerate, you're rerunning the result selector, or you need to do some sort of complicated, lazy caching of the result selector.
Yeah, I was wondering if that would be something in the future we would want to do, and then this would prevent us from doing that, the caching method that you were mentioning.
Is it significantly different from with the regular link to enumerable? I mean, there as well, you're doing the result selectors up front, but technically you could do them when you enumerate the grouping.
Yeah, but here the result selectors are value tests, so maybe there is some cost with even invoking it in the beginning that you can avoid if if you don't enumerate it. Like
it's just a question of sync versus async. It's not actually saying anything about how expensive they are. I could be doing a massive computation in my result selector with link.
Yeah, that's true.
Come on, Steve. Nobody would write a ray tracer in Link, right?
Yeah, no one would do that.
Never. But yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we should just stay as close to the non-async methods as possible. If we were going to make alterations, like I do think, to your point earlier, like group by almost has the wrong name, like because that's what you reach to when you want to basically create this like aggregate dictionary thing instead of to lookup, or at least that's what I reach to. So maybe that's my own bias, but I'm like, we should have used group by to return a lookup instead of
let's not reinvent Link. The name's already given to us. They already exist.
Oh, no, we can't. We absolutely cannot. Like it would, the cure is worse than the disease.
I think this would be the same. Like I think the only thing I would get out of what Stefan's saying right now is everybody who's ever used group by has decided it's the wrong answer. Maybe we just drop it.
Right.
but we can't.
But that's also bad. Yeah, exactly.
I can guarantee you, I have definitely valid use cases of group by, and I don't use the other ones.
It's also one of the. I mean, it's on the short list of the most popular methods in Link. It has query comprehension support. Like you can write
because it has a good name. Right. Yeah. So I have a question for you, Emo. Like in the places where you use group by, could have you used lookup?
It could, but keep in mind where the whole thing came from. The whole thing came from SQL. Guess what you do in SQL? Group by. So that's where this comes from.
No, that's what I'm just saying. We kind of burned the good name on the worst functionality. That's
well, I mean, you can argue that the API shape of group by is bad, right? But I feel like the logical operation makes sense, and I mean. Yeah, if we had a type like, a multi-value dictionary or something like this, you could argue that's what we should have returned. But yeah, that goes back to we didn't have that, so we're stuck with iLookup and iGrouping.
Yeah, I think consistency is king here. We copy all the things. I was just pointing out that I very much like lookup more than group by, but I like the name group by better.
We've also started adding kind of accelerators that do the same thing as group by, but with specific purposes, like count by, aggregate by. They're all basically group by plus additional processing.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So yes, leave it matching.
More F sharp.
Yeah.
Okay, so Stefan, you had a question about I ordered async enumerable.
I did, and then I read more of the sync code, and then it made sense to me.
So there's an interesting thing here, which is worth a discussion. So I ordered async enumerable has to exist as a type in order to support only being able to use then by after you've used order by.
Yep.
However, as far as I can tell, we don't actually want anyone else other than us implementing this interface. I haven't found any realistic, meaningful cases where we want someone implementing I ordered async enumerable themselves.
Yep.
Or I ordered enumerable themselves. So we could not have any surface area on the interface itself and rely on the implementations poking at the actual concrete type that we return to back it and use whatever they want there.
But then does that mean then by shows up on everything? Which would be
no. We would still have the type. We would still have the interface, but the two methods on it would disappear. It would be an empty interface, a marker.
Huh.
So, but why do we need these methods?
Then by would just blow up if not provided like a real one.
Then by would throw an exception saying you can't do this. You're giving us a type we don't know about.
Yeah.
So
what's the advantage?
Let's just
hiding
close
some implementation detail effectively.
But it's
Would it-
already kind of there for the sync version. So
It is.
it's like-
Wouldn't
Yeah,
we
you'll
get the
notice
same
the sync
benefit?
version. Sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
Wouldn't we get the same benefit by just EB nevering the interface? Nobody would ever see it. Nobody would therefore derive it, and we don't care what the signature, whether it exposes the methods or not.
Well, but that's just the editor doesn't hide it, but this other one would actually prevent you from implementing it, right?
No, it would be worse because you would think you implemented it, and then you would runtime mismatch bind.
I don't think so. I think the compiler fails. It's the same thing when you have a private protected member in the class hierarchy.
What Steve was suggesting is not a compile failure. Yeah, it was just...
what I was suggesting wouldn't fail at compile time, it would fail at runtime.
Oh, because you would literally remove the methods. You wouldn't just hide them with visibility. You would literally
I mean, you could do
nuke them.
both, right? They're not mutually exclusive.
Not if we want down level support. I can't make these.
Yeah, that's true.
They have to be public.
That's true. Yeah, you can't. Yeah.
You could do EB never no members, and then do otherwise what.
Yeah, if you do EB never, if someone wanted to like not have everything on a single line, order by dot then by dot then by, they wanted to store it into a local, and then conditionally if blah added then by.
I see.
The interface wouldn't. EB never might make that a little complicated.
Just use var, right? Our favorite feature, always var. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fair.
/kick Stefan.
I think.
So
I mean,
the only reason I mention it is, if you look at like this isn't exactly what the sync enumerable looks like because this needs to support both the sync and async. So there's two overloads here.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to add multiple methods on this interface, one for the sync case and one for the async case. And
yep.
I don't know. It felt icky to me when I'm looking at this. Like, why does this I ordered enumerable thing exist? And yeah. I mean, I've written a bunch of tests, but I haven't actually tested to see what would happen if someone provided their own implementation.
I mean, if the real one can work, this one it should be possible as long as we're not actually using internal members.
I don't know.
This is actually a factory.
No, it's
only for nested, like for subsequent
a transformation. It's not static. Yeah.
Oh, so it's a marker, but then has a subordinate factory.
Well, it's supposed to make. So I read the code while we were talking about other things, but I think it's just supposed to make it more efficient to apply like multiple orders, like order by, then by, then by, like
So it is an async enumerable that allows you to produce another one that has more comparisons built into it.
Yeah. It's basically what the implementation for then by will call, right?
Yeah, I was just making sure that it was intentional, that it doesn't say static.
No, it's intentional. Yeah,
the
implementation of then by literally just calls create ordered async enumerable.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, honestly, like I think given that it's already the pattern in other places where people could do the same thing potentially and it hasn't harmed anything, it seems almost backwards to go out of our way to like hide things from this type. It's like I would just leave it as infrastructure, like pretty much how I ordered enumerable works as well.
Okay.
In terms of like publicness, I don't know exactly what the implication is when you were to support async enumerable NEF, for example. I'm not sure they would have to call back into those things to construct things on on your behalf. That might be another reason why we want this just as public infrastructure, so that things like EF can call into it.
I'll sync up with Shai to make sure we're not doing anything that's going to cause problems.
But I also suspect until we actually do it, we probably won't find out. So there's that.
What do we consider single and first to be? Those are syncs.
Yeah.
So it's .single async and .first or default async.
Yep.
Okay. Makes sense. Okay, did we get through the list of talking
Got
points?
through a list of all my open issues.
So for to
Otherwise,
observable, we don't have the equivalent for IEnumerable, right? Or do we?
We do not. We don't have an IEnumerable to IObservable. IObservable is in the async realm, and so I felt it made two reasons. One, I felt it kind of made sense here, but also it's the only kind of functionality that was in the System.Linq.Async that wasn't in System.Linq enumerable, and I don't want someone to be in a world where they're using functionality that they can't migrate away from.
Yeah. Presumably people could do
one-liner with public types, or is this complicated?
Say that again, Jeremy.
Is to observable simply new observable of source, or is it more complicated than
It's
that?
about half a page of code. Basically,
Okay.
you have to return an iDisposable that's able to unregister, which basically just means that a disposable that triggers a cancellation token, and then you have an implementation of iObserver
Right. So we don't have an existing public observable type that can feed or can just take a async enumerable source. So this is
it.
This is creating that concept. Okay.
Yeah.
And presumably
it was the only holdup of why they were using that, but it's a one-liner. Then I was going to say maybe we don't care, but if it's not a one-liner, then maybe we care.
It's not a one-liner, but it's also not complicated.
And then if I have it enumerable and I want an observable, I just have to say enumerable dot to async enumerable dot to observable, right? So I could still do that. Probably not pretty, but it would get the job done.
Correct. What were you going to say, Stefan?
Okay. I mean, we probably don't love it because it's like an object model, but there's observable collection, which takes an IEnumerable, right?
But that's not an IObservable. It's just using the same word.
Oh, LOL. I've actually used that before. Okay. Never mind. Would we consider that then, though, for IEnumerable, like for consistency, since everything else we're trying to be consistent?
I don't think it really makes sense for enumerable. It's
I
like
could see it. Like if you're playing around with data, like I don't know, like if you're trying to write code that can work async, but I'm just like testing it with certain data as quickly as possible.
You could call it. You could do what Emo said, which is just .to async enumerable .to observable.
Yeah,
you could. That's slightly less discoverable, but yes,
it is. I don't know how discoverable it needs to be.
Yeah.
I mean, it's worthwhile taking a look. I'm fairly confident that somewhere in reactive there is a method that takes an enumerable and gives you back an IObservable. It's probably not in the same namespace as the async enumerable is. But so if the argument is you want to help people that move away from that, then it might be worthwhile adding this one method on the other side. But
I would not be surprised at all if that's in System.React, if that's in reactive, but it's not in System.Linq.Async.
Right.
So we'd also have to worry about, I mean, I guess we have to worry about this already, is like this will, of course, conflict with some libraries, but you would assume that they would remove it. Like in this case, I
think I understand what you're saying. So we also don't have really methods for IObservable, right? Like there's no union by or group by or select for observables, right? Which I think reactive has.
Right.
That's what .NET. That's what System.Reactive is. Like
yeah,
.NET Reactive is all about providing link for IObservable,
right?
And all the variations they have of it, IObservable or whatever that type is called.
Well, so do you think the System.Reactive or whatever it is already has the to observable on IAsync enumerable? Like,
they have it in System.Linq.Async.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. But that you can just remove because we're like wholesale replacing it. But like,
that's why I presume here.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm worried, like, are there any other libraries that would have to observable? I guess probably not, if it would conflict.
We can check. I would be surprised if reactive had an IAsync enumerable to observable method, because that would conflict between System.Linq.Async and reactive.
That makes sense.
So here's a thought experiment then. What would happen if we were to remove to observable? Because it seems like if we use observables, you kind of still want to use reactive then, because we really don't have much for you to begin with.
What would happen is if they don't have, if reactive doesn't have an async enumerable to observable method, then you wouldn't be able to do that.
Well, right, but like, isn't that on them to add then?
Well, my point is it has it. It's just have it in the library that we're planning to obsolete with this. So you could, your
Sure.
suggestion could be like they should add it to reactive, which is okay. We could remove from here and just say it needs to be added over there.
It just seems like yeah, I guess it's just the method itself doesn't bite people much. They still need a large chunk of the other thing. It's just the question is how is the other thing layered right now, right? But
I think you're basically asking, is it closer to this or to that?
Yeah, pretty much.
And
yeah,
if we want to, I only added it here to be a complete replacement. If we don't think that that's worthwhile, we can totally remove it, or we can add it later.
Yeah, I'd be tempted to add it later. Like I get wanting to make it a wholesale replacement, but I'm looking and like it doesn't look like we accept iObservable as a parameter or return it from anything in the core.
I can think of one place where we use it with in TPL data flow, but other than that, we added the interfaces back in .NET Framework 4.0, I think, and we never did anything with them in the framework itself.
Yeah, we supported SignalR, but other than that, like I can't think of anywhere. Like
Oh, one question I had for Steven. So for the upcoming C# extension thing, right? Wouldn't the extension type syntax remove the problems we have with off type and cast? Because at that point, the method that you declare is an instance method, so it would be single arity. Because the T source basically is part of the type rather than the method syntax. Wouldn't
That's
that
a good point? I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, it's possible we would change the plan for those two methods to be on the new plan, which then begs the question whether this whole type would shift over.
I mean, I still don't quite understand enough about this, but the lowered representation is basically still individual methods, right? It's just you don't have the metadata for the extension types anymore, right? But so you could basically still live in a world, I guess, where the down level supports is still just simple methods that take two generics. And it just happens to be when you're on a C# language version that supports extension types, you get away with not having to specify two arguments.
That's a good point. I will sync up with Mads and see
whether it solves it.
Whether that solves it. And what implications, if any, that would have for everything else.
Yeah. I mean, they seem to be pretty committed to make Mitch and Match work, though. So we'll see. Anything else we haven't talked about yet? I feel like we covered everything.
I think that's everything I had on my list. Thank you all for staying 45 minutes.
Are we dropping to observable?
I said consider in my feedback. I don't feel super strongly about it. It just seems like not enough value is provided, given that you still need the rest.
Fair enough.
But I could see a world where, you know, if observables take off, that we would basically undo this and kind of add to observable to both, right? To the regular enumerable and then the async enumerable, and but yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of wavering on this too. I've been back and forth, but if it really doesn't cause a conflict and it's a lot of code, which it sounds like it's not an insignificant amount of code, then it seems nice.
I mean, I guess it also depends on where it's going, right? Like if this is literally the last method that keeps people referencing System.Linq.Async, and then the whole package just collapses down to a singular method, at that point, yeah, maybe we should just add the method so you can completely drop it. Or wherever the extension methods for observable lives, they just add an extension method there for async enumerable, right? Because from their point of view, all of those types are in the platform layer, so it wouldn't really change any dependencies they would have.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be in the system.reactive instead, but it should definitely be there when we kind of release this package or soon after, because I could see people using it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels, my gut says the one for synchronous enumerable and asynchronous enumerable should live close together, and it feels weird that we're saying we don't need the synchronous one because they have the synchronous one and we just need to make the asynchronous one. So it feels like we need to just get them to go out and overload to something. I don't know, organizationally speaking or world speaking, who them is, but
Well, them being our friends that maintain the package. I mean, Claire is probably one of the bigger ones there. I'm not sure who else is there.
Right. I guess, unlike other APIs where we could always add it later, like being an extension method on a popular type, like it's kind of like we either are claiming it now or someone else is going to make it. I get that it's already in this other package that we're putting.
Well, I mean, but it's not. But the key thing is, it's not a random other package, right? The random other, or the family of packages that they provide, is the thing you need if you do anything useful with observables to begin with. Because, well, like, how is it going to use my observable? We have nothing. We have only the interface in the box.
I agree with that. Yeah, so I'm fine either way, and I think having them do it is reasonable, or having that package do it, the reactive one.
All right, then let's do that for now. Seems none of us feel like it has to be removed. We all just stated a preference. God damn it. Here we go. Somewhere. Sweet. Well, that was the first big one of the year.
Thank you all.
Thank you. And then I see you guys next week.
Yep.